And Ed O'Keefe joins us from Wilmington, Delaware this morning. Paula Reid is also joining us from the White House. Ed, over to you first. We just heard in your piece, President-elect Biden is set to meet with members from the NAACP on Tuesday. This, of course, comes as he faced a little criticism that his cabinet is not diverse enough. What are you hearing will be the focus of the meeting?
Just that, diversity, not only of personnel, but of ensuring that the policies implemented by the Biden administration are properly reflecting the concerns of the nation's African-American, Asian, Latino populations. There was a similar meeting with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus yesterday, and Biden's incoming Chief of Staff, Ron Klain. There were some discussions about making sure that there are a sufficient number of Latinos in the cabinet, some groups calling for 5 to be in the 15 or so member cabinet. African-American civil rights groups like the NAACP, the National Urban League, are also pushing for this. Part of this, in my conversations with folks that are members of these groups, leaders of these groups, is that they are coming off of 4 or 5 years, essentially, of a real stark lack of diversity, not only in personnel decisions made by the Trump administration, but in policies implemented or not implemented by various departments and agencies. And some of them admitted that they're getting pressure from their own members. Mark Morial, the head of the National Urban League, said that he had a meeting earlier this week with members of his Kansas City chapter who called him out almost immediately in a conversation, saying, wait, he named a Treasury Secretary, a Secretary of State, and a Homeland Security Secretary, and none of them were black. What are you doing to push the administration to make sure that there are African Americans in prominent positions? And so he said, they'll continue to do that. We expect to hear more about this in the coming days, in part because we're expecting a few more announcements, likely in the health realm, from the president-elect, of people who will be serving alongside him.
So, Paula, President Trump addressed questions about Attorney General Bill Barr during the Presidential Medal of Freedom ceremony yesterday. Here's what he had to say when he was asked whether or not he still had confidence in his Attorney General.
Ask me that in a number of weeks from now. They should be looking at all of this fraud. They haven't looked very hard, which is a disappointment, to be honest with you, because it's massive fraud.
So part of the reason the president was asked that question is because Bill Barr did an interview with the Associated Press, and he said, that the Justice Department couldn't find any proof of widespread fraud during this last election. So, the president with some sort of cryptic words. I will point out that the administration is obviously coming to an end. And so the likelihood of Bill Barr being out of that position in the coming weeks is a foregone conclusion. But I suppose the president could sort of add insult to injury and fire him earlier than that. What are we learning about this meeting, though, that Bill Barr had with President Trump?
Well, Anne-Marie, we have to remember this is one of the president's most loyal advisors. And we've learned that the president was not happy with the attorney general's remarks to the Associated Press. Interestingly, in that pool spray, the president, who is not a lawyer, he took issue with Bill Barr's comments that perhaps some of the complaints about the election that are coming forward are civil matters or things that should be handled locally and not by the federal criminal justice system. Well, the president dismissed that. He said, without evidence, he said that these are criminal matters, and he suggested that his attorney general has not tried hard enough. Now, that comment about asking me in a few weeks, it comes across as a veiled threat. Let's see what he does in the next few weeks. What's on the line? Will the attorney general be fired? It's possible, but most of the people I talk to say, look, it's unlikely. We're coming to the end of the term. But there are still questions about the FBI director, Christopher Wray. The president has repeatedly expressed his frustration about the FBI director, who's at the beginning of a 10-year term. So the president could certainly fire any of these people if he wants to. I am told that the president is increasingly unpredictable. And at the end of the day, really, he is the only one who knows who could potentially lose their job before January 20th.
And Paula, just to follow up on that, the Trump campaign continues to fight the election results in court. We've seen a lot of sort of strange videos of the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, another one of his attorneys, Jenna Ellis. But it seems as if this is not going anywhere, and it only is serving to sort of highlight the very stark differences between where the president is and even members of his own party. For example, with this authorization for the National Defense Act, this may be, the president keeps suggesting he's going to veto that, but Congress may, either choose to override that veto, or they may just wait till president-elect is in office.
All right, so two different issues there. The first is the ongoing litigation by the campaign. Let's handle that first. So the reporting we have there, just last night, the Wisconsin Supreme Court dismissed a petition by the campaign to review the election outcome. They kicked it back down to a lower court so they can figure out some factual issues. The Trump campaign, though, says they will continue to fight in Wisconsin. Why? Well, part of the reason is that since Election Day, the campaign and the RNC have raised over $200 million amid these false claims of a rigged election. So there's no sign of stopping, and it is significant that even as we lose around 2,000 people a day to COVID, the president's focus continues to be on litigation, settling scores, peddling these false claims, and raising money. Now, you also brought up the Defense Act. The president has suggested he may veto this act, which has been passed for 60 years by Congress, if lawmakers don't add a provision limiting the protections that social media companies have. Of course, the president is frustrated with various social media platforms because he believes that they are unfair to him when they flag his false tweets, his lies, and his false statements on his various social media accounts. But even members of his own party say that has nothing to do with this bill that helps to fund the military. Now, lawmakers could potentially get around a presidential veto. They need 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate. They have the votes. They need a bipartisan effort, clearly. But right now, it seems like they're calling the president's bluff. They don't actually think he's going to follow through with that. He's likely to continue to focus, though, on this litigation and peddling these false claims, which is helping him raise money.
Ed, meantime, President-elect Joe Biden has asked Dr. Anthony Fauci to stay on as his administration's chief medical advisor. We have now learned this morning that Dr. Fauci has accepted. Dr. Fauci has been somewhat sidelined, not somewhat, he has been sidelined, and in many cases muzzled by this current administration. His role in the next administration would be much bigger.
It sure appears that he will be, yes. The president-elect said last night in that interview that he had spoken with Fauci and had extended the offer, and this morning Fauci has said that he accepts. So essentially he'll continue as the nation's top infectious disease expert at the National Institutes of Health, and then probably show up more often in meetings with the president, directly advising him on issues concerning the pandemic. That is a difference from the current administration where, as you mentioned, he's been essentially sidelined. Look, throughout his campaign, Mr. Biden had said that he would bring Fauci back to the table, that he would listen more and put more stock in the opinions and the beliefs of scientists and medical experts who are actually tracking this. So a lot of what we're going to see from Team Biden in the early days of this administration is doing everything it can to try to do things differently than the Trump team has. And so if that means, elevating Fauci, calling for a mask mandate, as unpopular or as unfollowed as it may be across the country, calling for bipartisan work by Congress, all of it designed to demonstrate pretty quickly that they're doing things in almost the exact opposite way than the Trump administration. The one that I think will be most interesting to watch is what do they do about Operation Warp Speed, which is only just now really starting to get underway. Will, by January 20th, there be signs that it needs to be modified, or will it be working such that to mess with it would potentially slow the distribution of the vaccine? Biden didn't entirely get into that last night in that interview, but signaled that there's an expectation that they'll be keeping a close eye on it. So, the Fauci news was expected because it was a pretty prominent campaign vow, but it is an example of the kind of changes that we should expect almost overnight from the Biden team. Yeah, that's a good point, Ed. And Paula, the president-elect, practically every day, news coming out of his campaign or from the president-elect or the vice president-elect is about the coronavirus and the pandemic. For example, in an interview that he gave to CNN, he talked about asking Americans to wear masks for the first 100 days of his presidency. Meanwhile, the president of the United States has made no mention of the rising coronavirus cases nationwide. He is heading to Georgia to campaign for Republican senators facing runoff races next month. Now, he's got these continued claims of a rigged election, but so little coming from the White House with regards to the coronavirus, except when the president wants to talk about
getting credit for Operation Warp Speed. Are you hearing from anyone in the White House that someone is saying to the president, look, maybe you should address the fact that 2,800 people died yesterday? That's almost the same number, close to the same number of people who died on September 11th, and we're seeing that almost daily. But he's made no mention of that either in his tweets or in any statements.
Well, Vlad, in order to find that person to get into the president's ear, you'd need someone in this administration who is taking coronavirus seriously, who also has the president's ear. At this point, the president, he has not heeded the advice of his task force. There's been a lot of guidance overall from the federal government about how to mitigate the spread during this pandemic, but that advice has consistently not been followed by this White House, by the Trump campaign. You walk inside the West Wing, most people are not wearing masks. It makes it a little difficult actually to report here safely. Now, as the president has sort of abdicated or completely abdicated any leadership on the pandemic, Vice President Mike Pence, he has made some trips. Yesterday, he was traveling. He was in Memphis. He did a vaccine roundtable. But we really have seen quite a lot more of Dr. Anthony Fauci. He has been all over the airwaves, including with our Major Garrett making news on the Takeout podcast. He's really filled that void to be the source of leadership and information on the pandemic and on the vaccine. Dr. Deborah Birx, she has done a lot of local outreach, but Dr. Fauci right now is filling that void during the transition. You also mentioned Georgia. Yes, the president is headed to Georgia. He's going to campaign for those 2 Republican senators who face a runoff next month that will decide control of the Senate. But he has some GOP leaders kind of sweating right now because we know that once he has this rally, yes, he will likely encourage his supporters to go out and vote for these Republican leaders. But he's also expected to continue to attack specifically Georgia's voting system and Republican election officials in that state. And there are concerns about how that rhetoric could potentially impact turnout for this critical runoff. So it'll be a very interesting rally. He has a lot of Republicans in the state and around the country concerned about exactly how he's going to use his position and his power that he has over so many of his supporters.
Yeah, and we don't know if that's going to give us a little window into what might happen after January 20th and how he uses his influence and the tremendous amount of money he's raised. Ed, before we let you go, you are in Wilmington. Joe Biden's going to be delivering remarks on the final 2020 jobs report today. What can we expect to hear from him?
Well, given that only about 245,000 new jobs were created, it's likely that he'll, call that out and try to talk a bit more about the ongoing bipartisan attempts to pass something before Christmas to provide relief to the millions of Americans who are out of work or still looking for something new to do. And, if anything, likely a chance for him to amplify those calls. He has been critical throughout the summer, throughout the fall, of how the president was handling the economic rebound that, faced some perhaps contradictory data in that there was some pretty decent job growth there late in the summer, early in the fall. But this kind of slowdown already, economists this morning fearing it could be a signal of the kind of double-dip recession or potentially worse that the country's facing going into next year, with so many people still out of work, with so many industries reeling as the lockdowns and restrictions continue or are being put in place yet again. So I suspect he'll be somewhat critical and concerned about those numbers, and likely is going to focus on trying to get Congress to do something.
Yeah. Ed, Paula, once again, raining in Delaware, but not raining anywhere else. It's a strange phenomenon. But at least, Ed, you've got an umbrella.
Yeah, you're looking good, Ed. Looking good.
Yeah.
The Chesapeake Bay that likes to be wet.
Right. Makes sense. Thanks a lot, guys.